The American Institute for Managing Diversity presents Conversations in Diversity and Diversity Management, featuring Julian Bond, chairperson of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and Dr. R. Roosevelt Thomas, Jr., noted author, founder, and president of the American Institute for Managing Diversity. Moderated by Valerie Jackson, interviewer and host of the Public Broadcasting Atlanta radio show, Between the Lines. This program is made possible by the generous support of the UPS Foundation and in part by AFC Enterprises, Georgia Power, a Southern company, and Alston and Bird, LLC.
I have the honor of just expanding a little bit on the biographies of our two guests, and I'll start with Julian Bond. Most of us know that Julian Bond has been active in the civil rights movement throughout most of his life, from his college days as a founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to his present chairmanship of the NAACP. But for the few younger faces that I see in the audience, I'll share a few of the things that you may not know about Julian Bond. We know he was first elected in 1965 to the Georgia House of Representatives, but you may not know that it took 3 elections that he had to go through before the Georgia Assembly would seat him, would allow him to become a member. This was because they objected to his Vietnam stance. But eventually, on the 3rd time that he was elected to the seat, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Georgia House had violated his rights by not seating him, and he was finally seated. Most of us know that Bond ultimately served 4 terms in the House and 6 in the Georgia Senate. Some of you never knew, however, that at the Democratic Convention in 1968, Bond was nominated for Vice President of the United States, the first black to be so honored. Of course, he couldn't run because he was too young, so he had to decline. Since 1980, Julian Bond has been host and commentator on America's Black Forum, the oldest black-owned show in television syndication. His numerous national awards include, listed among Time Magazine's 200 Leaders list, and the prestigious National Freedom Award. Most of us know Julian to be a leader in the fight for civil rights, a writer, a lecturer, a teacher at Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and the American University in Washington, D.C. currently. But did you know he was a poet? He's been published in many national publications, too numerous to be mentioned. And Julian, one thing that you may not know is that the first time, if you remember, we ever met, you came to Virginia Commonwealth University. I was a student, and you spoke there around 1970 or 71. This was a predominantly white university. I was so proud of Julian Bond, and I admit, I had a little crush on you. And who would know that years later I'd marry a supersized Julian Bond? Anyway, Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, Jr., and my favorite uncle's name is Roosevelt, so you have a special place in my heart too. Dr. Roosevelt, for over 20 years, has been at the forefront of developing and implementing innovative concepts and strategies for maximizing organizational and individual potential through diversity management. In 1984, he was concerned about the inability of America's corporations and organizations to maximize the contribution of diverse employees. He founded the American Institute for Managing Diversity, Incorporated, a research and education enterprise. Dr. Thomas is the author of 6 published books, including Building a House for Diversity, Differences Do Make a Difference, Beyond Race and Gender. This is my favorite, Giraffe and Elephant, a diversity fable. And it's the cutest thing. I'll have to ask him to share that with you. In 1998, the National Academy of Human Resources elected and installed Dr. Thomas as a fellow. He has also been recognized by the Wall Street Journal as one of the top 10 consultants in the country. In 1995, he received the American Society for Training and Development's Distinguished Contribution to Human Resource Development Award. Maynard would be so proud that I'm sitting here among two great Morehouse men today. And I don't know if you've heard that saying or not, but there's a saying that says you can always tell a Morehouse man, you just can't tell him much. But this morning, we have two great Morehouse men who are here to tell us much. I'd like to start with you, Julian, because in a previous conversation, we were talking about the image of the NAACP today. Talk to me about the difference between the civil rights movement when you started 40 years ago or more and what it's doing and its impact today.
Oh, the civil rights movement is, first of all, a movement. And that makes it different, I think, from diversity, which I think of as a process. It's not to say people that working for diversity can't be in a movement too, but the civil rights movement was a movement, a small d-democratic movement of hundreds of thousands of people who were interested in extending civil rights. And civil rights are the positive legal prerogatives that all Americans enjoy, especially freedom from discrimination based on immutable characteristics. And that movement, which I joined 40 years ago, had been long established. It was primarily black in origin, makeup, and motivation, but always was diverse. And it used every advocacy tool, legal, protest, and much, much more. Diversity I tend to think of as this process and ongoing. It's multi-ethnic and diverse. And the tools it uses are primarily education, persuasion, all of these backed up by law. And so these two things are different, but seems to be extremely complementary. I serve as the chairman of the diversity committee of the Premier Auto Group. That's Volvo, Jaguar, Land Rover, and Aston Martin. And our slogan is that diversity makes business sense, that these companies that make these premier automobiles can't be successful unless their workforce, their marketing, their vendors, unless everything about them reflects the diversity that is America. And if they don't do that, they're not going to sell cars. And I think these two movements, or this civil rights movement, the diversity process, are of necessity different sides of the same coin. I think they are different. They're different things. But that doesn't mean they're oppositional. It means they're complementary.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the problems might be that we don't all understand what diversity really is. Dr. Thomas, how do you define diversity?
I think about diversity as the differences, similarities, and tensions that can exist among the elements of a mixture. But I also make a distinction between diversity and diversity management. Diversity management is a process of making quality decisions in the midst of differences, similarities, and tensions. Now, diversity management is what we have not focused upon up to this date. I believe that diversity management is the critical aspect that's required to help us deal with the complexities that can come with diversity.
I've heard people say, well, why do we need diversity management? We've got affirmative action working quite well.
Diversity management and affirmative action are different. Affirmative action is primarily a tool that can be used to create workforce pluralism, if you would. Now, once you get those differences, similarities, and tensions as a result of affirmative action, the issue becomes how do you go about making quality decisions in the midst of those differences, similarities, and tensions. If you can't come to grips with that, then you have the issue of retention. You have the issue of utilization as well.
How does diversity, in your eyes, complement the civil rights movement, Julian?
The one is the reason and the rationale for the other. The civil rights movement is an ongoing phenomenon. It takes different shapes and has many different personalities in it. But its central aim is to eliminate discrimination based on race. That's not to say that there aren't other parts of it that involve women, gays and lesbians, Latinos, Asians, people with disabilities, relatively long list of people who struggle in this country to make sure they gain civil rights and their civil rights are protected. While that struggle takes place, there is this complementary process taking place, chiefly but not exclusively in our larger institutions, in the corporate world, in education, and in other parts of American society. And this process, as Dr. Thomas has said, not only has to ensure that people don't face the kind of barriers we formerly faced in the United States, and so to some small degree still face, but that the process of removing those barriers becomes not just institutionalized, but also ongoing, so that a gain won today isn't just celebrated and remembered, but becomes the foundation for the gain of tomorrow, and so on and so forth.
In one of your courses, one of the tapes that I saw of your work, Dr. Thomas, you talked about the roots of an organization and sometimes how the roots had to be changed in order to affect what the overall bottom line or objective of the company is. How do you see the roots of the civil rights organization today? Do you think they might need some adjustment?
I think if you think about any organization that's been in existence for a number of years, 50, 60, 70, 80, even today, 10 or 20, more and more you're having to look at the roots. It used to be that to talk about the roots of an organization was something that was real traumatic. People didn't want to deal with that. 20 years ago, when I talked about roots, as you just indicated, people would say, we can't change the culture of the organization. Today, people routinely talk about the possibility of having to change the culture. That's in part because the environment is dynamic, the environment's changing. So I would suspect that civil rights organizations, like most organizations, would find it useful to examine their roots and to ask, will these roots allow us to move forward toward our goals?
Julian, has the NAACP maybe even done something like that already?
We're an organization constantly in flux and change. There's much about us that we have no desire to change and don't intend to change. And there's much about our culture that we do not intend to change. But there's also much about our culture that we know we badly need to change. And we've taken over, we're 95 years old. We've taken over all these years various steps in various parts of our growing and learning process, steps to change them. We're just right now in the process of revising the way the board of directors I chair operates. It operates now in sort of a standard way, the way most policymaking boards of nonprofit organizations do. But we found that it over time has become, I'm running for re-election next month, so I need to be careful about what I say, that it could stand some improvement. And at our last board meeting in October, we voted some improvements and structural changes, which aren't important here and probably wouldn't mean much to most people here. But when we meet again in February, we're going to be a very different kind of organization. That's the board of directors. You know, I'm surprised. Here we are in the middle of January, and I'm surprised that I haven't yet read, I know I will, I haven't yet read someone say, this is the new civil rights. This is the new civil rights issue of the 21st century. Because somebody said it last January, and somebody's going to say it next January. And we don't believe there are new civil rights issues. We don't believe that. We believe the issue for civil rights organizations is to fight against discrimination. That's what we did 95 years ago when we were founded. That's what we're doing today. Luckily, because of the efforts we've made and many, many, many others have made, the fight is very different. Many of the victories have been won. Now they've got to be implemented, cemented, and protected. But we don't believe there are new civil rights issues. We believe there are new ways of doing the old things. And we are determined to ensure that we do the old things in newer, better, and more efficient ways.
Is there an issue of diversity? Did you deal with diversity within the organization?
We deal with diversity with, oh yes, very much so. We were founded by an interracial group of whites, blacks, Jews, Christians, atheists. I'm sure small collection of socialists, really a diverse population, created the NAACP in 1909, and we don't enjoy that diversity today. From a board of directors of 64 people, we have one white person, and that's to our discredit. Where our membership used to be a little more diverse, say 40 years ago, than it is today, it now is overwhelmingly black. We wanted to be understood that in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we believe colored people come in all colors, and anyone who shares our values is more than welcome.
Dr. Thomas, in your book, Giraffe and Elephant, which I really love, talk about how you use the example of the giraffe and the elephant to explain diversity.
We use the example of giraffe and elephant to really make the point about diversity referring to differences and similarities of any kind. We talk about a giraffe who builds a house for a giraffe, decides to invite the elephant in to work in his basement on a basement business. And you can imagine an elephant coming into a giraffe house. There's a possibility that all kinds of adjustments will have to be made. This puts on the table, the giraffe basically says to the elephant, glad to have you here. The elephant tries to negotiate the house, cracks the frameworks, cracks the steps, cracks the walls. And giraffe comes down and asks the elephant, what are you doing? The elephant says, trying to make myself at home. Giraffe says, well, let's look at the situation. Why don't we ask you to go to an aerobics studio, slim down, and then you'll be able to get to the door frames easier. Then the elephant says, giraffe says, I think if you go to the that same mall where the aerobics studio, there's a ballet studio. You go there, you go to the aerobics studio, you slim down, you become more flexible, and you'll be okay in this house. Now what it does, it makes the point that the giraffes of the world tend to put the onus of changing on the elephant. Now you might ask, who are the giraffes, who are the elephants? Well, the giraffes and elephants could be of many types. My experience with diversity started as a doctoral student, studying under two professors who were concerned about functional diversity. Question was, how do you have in one organization marketing, manufacturing, research, other functions, by definition, by necessity, different, to deal with their different tasks, yet at the same time part of an integrated whole? Key concepts were differentiation and integration. Not uncommon to have a giraffe function. This is a marketing company. So if you were not in marketing, you were in an elephant function. So the point we try to make with the giraffe and elephant fable, this notion of diversity refers to any types of differences, similarities, and tensions. Now, diversity management then becomes a capability that you can use wherever you need to address differences, similarities, and related tensions. You can use it in talking about acquisition merger diversity. You can use it in talking about cultural wars diversity. What we call cultural wars are basically diversity tensions. You can use it in talking about diversity in the family. You can use it to talk about racial and gender diversity. It's a capability. Diversity management is a craft with methods, a craft with concepts, principles, skills, and it requires practice, serious practice. In our society, we have not yet to put diversity management on the table, not to mention devoted the amount of practice necessary to master the craft. I'm reminded of my personal situation with golf. I've been meaning to get on the golf course for about 10 years. I finally got out there, and I'm on the driving course, and I'm taking sort of ad hoc lessons from a friend, and I don't practice. So we go out about every 2 or 3 months, and finally he said to me in frustration, Roosevelt, after I had hacked and missed several balls, I don't think you're going to get any better without practice. And he was being kind. I was not going to, not only was I not going to get any better, I was not going to get off square one without practice. I think our country, our organizations haven't gotten off square one. I think that's in part because we are confused about what is diversity, from where does it come, and how does it relate to the civil rights movement. And often people can't get in touch with diversity and talk about how these two perspectives can complement each other because they cannot differentiate the two. So people will say to me, Roosevelt, I know you're going to be very busy during the Martin Luther King celebration period. Well, truth be told, that's probably the least busy of the times of the year for me, in part because people don't know where does this thing called diversity fit in.
Is affirmative action still a very viable tool, Julian?
Oh, of course it is. And I think you have only to look at the long, long, long list of American corporations who filed on the good side in the briefs and the Gutter v. Bollinger case at the University of Michigan decided by the Supreme Court last year. Clearly, the corporate America understands and embraces the idea of affirmative action and wanted it protected and defended, and demonstrated that through their actions in this legal case and in the fact that many, I mean, think how many people here are diversity officers of their corporations. That's a job that didn't exist some years ago. No one did that.
But listen, you're saying diversity.
But let me say something else about Maynard.
Okay. Well, if you say Maynard, I'll stop.
You know, I remember when this airport was being built and opened, and the city applied these affirmative action regulations. I remember the car companies, the car rental companies particularly, really didn't want to do this and said, we're not going to do it. And Maynard said, fine, you don't have to do it, but your your desk is going to be in Hapeville, you know, and people want to rent one of your cars, are going to have to take a cab over there to get you. But the other thing he did, and this is so significant to me, those of you old enough to have come in and out of the old airport, remember there used to be a shoe shine stand? Mm-hmm. And who works at a shoe shine stand? Shoe shine boys. They might be 40, 50 years old, they're shoe shine boys. Maynard made that possible for them to own that stand, and the shoe shine boys became shoe shine men. And that's what affirmative action does at its very best when it's practiced at its very highest.
But most people think of affirmative action and diversity as the very same thing. You spoke to the nuance, but how do you explain it, Julian?
Well, because when I began, I said, I think of diversity as a process. Right. I think of affirmative action, Dr. Thomas said, as a tool. Affirmative action is a tool that corporations, educational institutions, other people employ or employ to ensure that the playing field for the affected populations is relatively level. Diversity is the process through which many of these same institutions undergo, it's ongoing and continuing, to make sure that not only once there is a critical mass of members of the protected classes in an institution, but as they are coming and as they are entering, that the process runs as smoothly, as fairly, absent these tensions Dr. Thomas talks about, as possible. So these are, again, complementary, but very, very different things.
Well, Dr. Thomas, why do we have to have managers of diversity? Why don't we just have excellent managers?
I think the reality is that when you have diversity, you introduce a degree of complexity that we don't anticipate. I think when in the civil rights movement, as I remember it, Dr. King and others emphasized the fact that we were all human beings, we were all the same. In that process, we downplayed the fact that while we're all basically the same, we are significantly different. Those differences complicate the decision-making process. I'm reminded of a principal who has 39 ethnicities in his student body. And it's an elementary school, I think. And he has been heard to say on a number of occasions, if I can just get through the day without an explosion, that is success. And somebody finally took it to task. How can you have such low aspirations for something as important as educating our young people? Now, you talk to him, he did not have low aspirations. He was basically saying, I've got a lot of complexity here with 39 ethnicities. I can't find a diversity management book to help me deal with 39 complexities. I can't find anybody in the central office to come over and help me deal with it, so I'm muddling through. I think affirmative action, I'm very pro-affirmative action, but I think affirmative action is a symptom of our inability to effectively manage diversity. So if I can manage diversity, I'll get the representation, I'll get the inclusion. But if I can't manage diversity, I need this crutch to help me proactively go out. Now, I say that as an advocate of diversity, of affirmative action, but I also say it as one who believes we've got to get to the point where we don't need the crutch or any Band-Aid to be able to make quality decisions in the midst of differences, similarities, and tension. We don't assume across the board assimilation. We assume assimilation with respect to requirements. The challenge is to be clear about what is a requirement, a bona fide, gut-level, gut-wrenching requirement that I have to conform to, versus a preference, convenience, or tradition that may not be a requirement. Now, as I talk to people around the country, what I find is people are not clear about what the requirements are, whether they're CEOs or rank-and-file members, and often they will say, after we introduce the concept of requirements, how do we determine what the real requirements are? And so the tradition has been, with respect to affirmative action, we bring you in with the expectation that you will assimilate. Now, what is complicating affirmative action in one sense is people are less willing to assimilate across the board without question. So once you say, I'm not going to assimilate, you're putting more and more diversity, differences and similarities into play.
Do the two almost become competitive then?
What,
Julia?
differences and similarities?
Well, the search for diversity versus affirmative action.
No, see, I don't think you have to really search for diversity. I mean, I think it's important to say diversity with respect to what? I think part of our challenge in not understanding diversity is we assume diversity is race and gender. I can look out at this audience and say this is a diverse audience. And most people will immediately say, I'm talking about what? Race and gender. But there are a lot of diversity dimensions out here, some I can't see. Whether you're talking about the ways of thinking, degrees, geographic origin, or whatever.
Union, non-union, age.
Right.
You also said that affirmative action is a temporary corrective
I think it was
action.
intended to be temporary. I think it's becoming a quasi-permanent crutch. Now, the Supreme Court has implied, at least some people read it as being the implication, that you have 25 more years with affirmative action. Question becomes, if we're going to get to the point where we will not need affirmative action in 25 years, what will we have to do? I think we'll have to have a diversity management capability.
Dr. Thomas is quoting Sandra Day O'Connor, who said in her portion of the decision that she expected roughly 25 years from last summer, then the need for affirmative action be no longer required. It's interesting, in her memoir, she answers the rhetorical question, when will we know that women have been absorbed into the society? And she says we'll only know that when women are represented in proportion to their numbers in the population in every institution of society. And I give it to Justice O'Connor, if it's good enough for women, it's good enough for all the other beneficiaries of affirmative action too.
Julian, do you think there are some issues that the civil rights community are not facing? What are the burning issues that you feel that we are not dealing with or tackling seriously?
I actually do not. You know, there's this awful story in Time magazine this week, 2-page spread about the NAACP, and it's so typical of journalists who write about civil rights. They write about the civil rights movement they want to see, not the civil rights movement it is. And they write about things they want the civil rights movement to do, not what the civil rights movement wants to do. And there's a quote in there from a woman who teaches at Northwestern, says that the NAACP does nothing about people in prison, does nothing about the scourge of AIDS, and does nothing about women's access to reproductive rights and freedoms. I was a speaker at the 1 million-person March of Women this summer in Washington, supporting women's right to reproductive health. This has been an issue for the NAACP since 1930. Our founder, W.B. Du Bois, was a close companion of Margaret Sanger, the mother of birth control in the United States. He helped to promote birth control clinics with the Urban League in New York City, and he said that until women have control over their biological health and their childbearing functions, they're not going to be equal citizens in our society. So this has long been an issue for us. We have 60 branches in prisons around the United States. These work with the inmates to help them overcome the scourge of recidivism that sends so many right back in as soon as they get out. And we work with their families on the outside and employers and others to find jobs and other things for them. We're spending $1 million this year on AIDS prevention and education programs. So when I read this in Time magazine and I know what kind of circulation it has and the numbers of people are going to read it and believe it, it's just so irritating because the journalists who wrote, the two people who wrote this story, knew all these things I've told you. But you pick up your copy of Time magazine and see if any of them are there.
How does one think about managing diversity? What approach should we take?
I think there is something we call strategic diversity management, and I think it has some basic concepts. One, diversity management, as we talked about it. It also has a very important concept, I think, and I refer to it as the concept of being diversity challenged. And all that means is I have difficulty making quality decisions in the midst of differences, similarities, and tensions. Now,
Quality decisions?
and a quality decision is one, if I'm talking about an organization, it takes me toward my mission, vision, and strategy. If I'm talking about myself personally, it takes me toward my personal goals.
Your personal values?
All I'm about personally, my priorities.
All right.
Now, to be diversity challenged, we have difficulty saying we are diversity challenged. Individuals have difficulty saying, organizations have difficulty saying, we are diversity challenged with respect to whatever. And they have difficulty saying it because they see being diversity challenged as being akin to being a racist or being a sexist, and that's bad. But I can be diversity challenged without being a racist, without being a sexist. I can be diversity challenged because I can't deal with the complexity of the situation. I talked about my principal friend. He was diversity challenged with respect to 39 ethnicities. Not necessarily because he was biased against those 39 ethnicities, but because he couldn't deal with the complexity of how do you develop an organization that can work for 39 ethnicities.
Well, what would you have suggested to him?
Oh, I would suggest that one thing he would have to do is to be clear about what are the absolute requirements around which he cannot in any way compromise. Now, outside of that, in the area of preferences, conveniences, and traditions, he would have to be flexible. Now, the challenge is most of us have difficulty with that flexibility. It's like saying I can accept diversity in the area of non-requirements, but around requirements, there is no room for diversity. Now, many people say,
break that down to me. Maybe I'm slow this morning, but break it down to me about the requirement and so forth. Do it again, please.
Well, I give you an example. I was with a group of a CEO and about 15 of his people. And we had been with him for about 2.5 days. So I turned to him and said, will you close the day out? He said, Roosevelt, the session out. He said, Roosevelt, I'm sitting here thinking, I don't think we know what the requirements are. He said, the world is changing, our industry is changing, our corporation is changing. I don't think we know what the requirements are. And then he went on to say, for example, we have here in our corporation, if you're going to be successful, you've got to have a spouse. Again, everybody sort of said, okay. And he said, well, is that a requirement? And somebody said, no, you don't have to have a spouse. You got to have a wife. And she has to fit a certain set of criteria. And there were 14 men around the table and 1 woman. This was his senior team. Everybody nodded. He asked, is that a requirement? And the room was quiet. Then somebody said, well, hey, if you want to talk about requirements, we got this set of requirements. If you're going to get into senior management, you've got to be known by senior managers. So people compete to be known in the context of work, but also in the context of golf. So if you're not a golfer, you've got a problem. So somebody said, what about the young people who don't play golf and seem determined never to play golf? And somebody said, that's their tough luck. Somebody else said very quickly, that's our tough luck. You're telling me I can't access talent, even proven talent, just because it won't get on the golf course? And the CEO very carefully said, is that a requirement? The room was quiet. He said, we need to come back and let's just spend 2 days just trying to sort out what are the requirements, absolute must, versus preferences, conveniences, and traditions. And most organizations haven't done that. This one time at a place that has the Inroads program, and a fellow got up as he was leaving. He said, you know, I'm about to go pick up an Inroads intern. They told me to assimilate him. And I'm about to assimilate him. And he said, that's not what I hear you saying, but that's what they told me to do. And I'm about to assimilate him with respect to requirements, preferences, conveniences, and traditions. Now, if that young Inroads person fights back, then you got diversity tension, and we believe that you're going to have diversity tension. I mean, it's a given. If you have differences and
tension
similarities,
is not always bad. Tension could be good.
It's a reality here. And if I can't figure out how to make decisions in the midst of differences, similarities, and tensions, I am going to remain diversity challenged. Now, not just leaders, rank and file contributors as well. That Inroad intern needs to know how to manage diversity. How do I make decisions as a part of this diverse mix? But the concept of being diversity challenged, we've got to come to grips with that, because if I can't say I am diversity challenged, therefore I need to improve. My organization's diversity challenged with respect to whatever, therefore I need to improve. There is no motivation.
Give me another word for diversity challenged. Closed-minded?
I'm sorry?
What's another phrase for diversity challenged?
Diversity incompetent?
Okay.
But let's be clear. We all are diversity challenged in some form or fashion. And maybe and I would say in each aspect of our life. Our country is diversity challenged with respect to politics. I mean, we worry about the divisiveness of politics. You have people worried about the fragmentation of our society, a diversity issue. How do you have these serious, significant differences and yet remain integrated? Now, what we have determined is, in the midst of crises, we don't have a problem with integration. And in 9/11, people routinely said, isn't it a shame that we had this tragedy? But then in the next breath, they would say, I'm encouraged by the way we have come together, how unified we are. And then in the next breath, they say, I hope it lasts. Because they knew it was not going to last. We don't know how to get the integration in the midst of differences, similarities, and tensions. And Dr. King said in 1962 in a speech entitled, The Ethical Demands for Integration, it's not enough just to have desegregation, and I add racial pluralism. We got to worry about the spiritual integration as well. And he said, otherwise you've got physical proximity without spiritual affinity. And that's something that we're struggling with today.
The focus on the traditional categories like race and sex, do you think it's causing a diminishing of those particular
Well, I'm not
groups?
sure if I think there is a diminishing focus on those things, but I don't think it's because of the increased interest in diversity. I think there's the occasional connection between the two. But I tell you, a great deal was made year before last about the increased population of Hispanics. And you read headline after headline saying that Hispanics are overtaking black people. Well, how are Hispanics overtaking black people? African Americans are now and will be for years to come the largest racial minority in the United States. And the number of Hispanics who can be of any race doesn't affect that. In fact, it adds to it because many Hispanics are of African descent. But it set up a false kind of competition between these two groups and encouraged, in fact, a false kind of competition between these two groups. So I think there are occasions where the improper uses of diversity as a concept contribute to a diminution of a concentration on the members of the standard protected classes for whom our civil rights laws exist. You know, today, because of executive order, a legal decision, the protected classes now include a majority of all Americans, including the aged, and that's over 40, so most of you are aged, the infirm, the chemically dependent, the obese, as well as the standard categories we're all used to. That's a majority of the population of the country are now in some way or the other protected by our civil rights laws. And that kind of diminishing of emphasis on this group, that group, and the other obviously has some effect. Doesn't mean we ought to turn our backs on others, but...
Can an organizational culture be classified as diversity challenged? And if so, what could a possible catalyst be to change the culture?
Well, I think without a doubt an organization's culture can be diversity challenged with respect to whatever. Some are diversity challenged with respect to race, with respect to gender. And some are diversity challenged with respect to acquisitions and mergers. They buy buy companies, they expect to keep the senior management, can't keep the senior management. Now, what fosters change? You have to be clear conceptually. I think we don't take time to get conceptual clarity. So, and then we talk about diversity maturity in the sense of I acknowledge the fact that I am diversity challenged. I acknowledge the cost of being diversity challenged, and I also accept responsibility for managing diversity. Now, I think if an organization can do that and determine where it's diversity challenged, you can begin to create some urgency for change. The problem is you've got to get conceptual clarity before you can do that. When I say conceptual clarity, I don't mean that you've had exposure to it. I mean you've operationalized those concepts.
The first Bush administration posted, quote, the most diverse cabinet to date. However, it did not appear to manifest the quality of decision-making and policy issues. Please comment.
Well, it was the most diverse cabinet in history, except for the one just before it. But you know, Langston Hughes had a character he wrote about, a New York guy named Jesse B. Simple, S-E-M-P-L-E. Yes. And he published this column in newspapers, Simple Speaks His Mind. And one thing, he has the Langston Hughes figure, who's an intellectual, jousting with Simple, who's a working class guy. And the Langston Hughes guy saying, isn't it great we got Ralph Bunche at the UN? And Simple says, you know, the food he eats don't fill my stomach. And although it's admirable to see Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and Rod Page and others, these are great, great advances to see these faces in high places. But they tend to be more symbolic than real, and symbols are awfully important. Glad to have them. They are great recognition of achievement and accomplishment on the part of the people who stand in these places, but life is more complicated than that and requires more than that.
It's important to say diverse with respect to what? I mean, you can be very diverse with respect to race or very diverse with respect to this dimension and be very homogenous with respect to other dimensions. And I think that the fact that we tend to only associate diverse with race and gender hampers our understanding of diversity or even any assessment of how diverse a group is. And so I walk in the room and see racial pluralism, gender pluralism, and I say, this is a very diverse group. It may not be diverse at all. I have to see that their behavior, and their behavior may be so homogenous that the attributes of race and gender belie a much more critical sameness than the fact that, and so I think we have to get to the point where we look below what's the race. I'm not saying it's unimportant as much as I'm saying it's not the total picture.
What are your viewpoints on the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender population being considered protected under civil rights and diversity practices? And as students, managers, and leaders of diversity, What is our role and responsibility to the gay and lesbian community with regard to their current challenges, particularly but not limited to legal recognition of their unions?
I think the concept of diversity basically says if individuals are in the mix, then the challenge becomes how do you create an environment that engages those individuals? And diversity really puts on the table everyone in the mix. Sometimes in organizations, individuals will say, Roosevelt, I'm okay with diversity, but I cannot work with people who have different sexual orientations because of religious reasons. Then the question becomes, is your religion the requirement for being able to participate and be successful in this organization? And if we say that's not the requirement, then you have to talk about how do we make certain these individuals have the wherewithal to be successful.
You know, Valerie, there's a big debate and much resentment in the civil rights community about the comparisons between the gay and lesbian movement for justice and equality and the African American movement for justice and equality. That's, you know, the proposition suggests that there are no black gays or lesbians. But I'm flattered if someone wants to imitate and emulate the movement I'm a part of. I'm flattered if someone wants to sing the songs I sang. I'm flattered if someone thinks the effort I'm a part of is worthy of their adoption and gathering, and can't understand for the life of me why other people don't feel the same way. Now, the NAACP has no position on same-sex marriage. We vigorously oppose the constitutional amendment that failed in the Senate and the 11 state constitutional amendments which passed on November 4th because we thought they did something that this country has never done. They wrote bigotry into the Constitution, and we can't have that. My own position, and this is my position, this is not the NAACP's position, I'm very much in favor of civil unions, and cannot believe that my marriage would be threatened in any way because two people love themselves and want the state to sanction that marriage. I can't believe that will happen. And you know, I know there are a lot of biblical literalists, you know, there's a verse in Leviticus that says, you shall not lie with a man as you lie with a woman. There's another verse in that same chapter that says, you shall not wear clothes made of different cloth. And last time I was at the Baptist convention, I looked out and I saw these men with silk ties, cotton shirts, and wool suits. And I wanted to say, curse you, you unbeliever.
Could you please share one thing that each of us as individuals here today can do when we leave here to help us not be diversity challenged?
I think the first thing you have to do is identify where you are diversity challenged. There is no substitute for that. In our diversity leadership academies, we introduce the concept on one day. We then ask people to go home and over the 2 or 3 weeks between our meetings and to share the concept, and then to ask people to indicate where they see you being diversity challenged. Now, people come back, and many are reluctant to share. Many say, yes, I did find out something, and I'm not telling you. And others find out and they tell, and it's a painful kind of experience, it's a surprising kind of experience, and sometimes it affirms, I know I'm this way, I may be trying to change, or I may not be trying to change. But the point I want to be clear about is, unless you can articulate where you're diversity challenged, and then ask the question, are there costs associated with my being diversity challenged in this regard? Those are the first two questions, first two steps toward becoming diversity capable. And I need to say that if you become diversity capable, it doesn't mean you're no longer diversity challenged. It just means you figured out a way to get around being diversity challenged with respect to X, Y, or Z. It's a very growth experience. It's a developmental experience to just look in the mirror and say, where am I diversity challenged? Now, some people believe that certain people, because of their experiences, are not diversity challenged. People of color, women, because they've experienced discrimination and so forth. Not true. We all are diversity challenged. And our organizations are diversity challenged in some form or fashion.
How is the American Institute for Managing Diversity working with American schools to prepare our children for their future in America?
I think we would like to do more in education. We're beginning to explore how we can make this available to schools. We'd like to prepare, our dream is to prepare a curriculum from like K to 12 that can be used in the schools. But this is something that we still have on the drawing board. We have proposals that we're prepared, seeking to take this to young people. I think it's very important to do so. I think it's not, however, an issue of helping people be comfortable with diversity as much as it is giving them a decision-making capability in the midst of differences, similarities, and tensions.
The questioner would like to know if there has been anything added by law to require teachers or principals to be trained in managing diversity, not just race and cultural differences.
Now, it depends on how you define managing diversity. And we need to be clear. Society doesn't require an organization to manage diversity. So society says we want to see a representative workforce. We don't want discrimination. You end up with diversity. You decide to manage it or you decide not to manage it. That's your business. So society doesn't require management of diversity as we talked about it here today. Society says don't discriminate, and we would like to see a representative pluralistic organization.
Is managing diversity only the problem of the manager? Does the diverse person have to make any changes?
Oh, a diverse person has to make all kinds of choices. I talked about that elephant. The giraffe says to the elephant, go to aerobic studio, go to the ballet studio, come back, you'll fit in. Well, that elephant has to make some managerial decisions at that moment. Number one, do I go to the aerobic studio? Do I go to the ballet studio? And even more importantly, can I trust the giraffe? Suppose I go there and I come back limber, I come back flexible. Now, first thing is going to happen when I come by the elephant compound, there is a danger that the elephant might say, who are you? What are you? And then I go over to the giraffe, and giraffe said, you haven't done enough. Then I'm caught in between giraffe land and elephant land. And I talked about that one night, and the fellow came up and he said, Roosevelt, I hadn't heard it put that way. And then he went into this hysterical laugh for about 2 minutes. And I'm standing there watching him. He's just laughing, and I'm saying, should I pull on his jacket or whatever to stop him? But he was dealing with the pain of being caught in no animal land. And there's nothing wrong with being caught in no animal land if you plan to be there. But the point I'm making is elephants do have to make choices. Elephants do have to decide, will I assimilate? And if so, where and how? And you better prepare to do that if you're clear about what are my requirements.
Well, here's a light question for you, Julian. Have you ever considered changing the name of the NAACP?
When I was 20, 21, 22, sure. I wanted to be the National Association for the Advancement of Black People. But this is a franchise name. This is like Coca-Cola. You see those initials, you know what people are talking about, you know the organization. We'd be foolish to change it. So not for a long time have I ever thought about changing it. I don't think anybody in the organization changing that.
And then you say, break it down to me about the requirement.
I give you an example. Well, I can give you an example. I was CEO of a group of people, a CEO and about 15 people. And we had been with them for about 2.5 days. So I turned to him and said, he said, Roosevelt, did a session. I said, Roosevelt, I'm seeing what you're thinking. I don't think the world is changing. The world is changing. Our industry is changing. Our corporation is changing. Then he went on to say, for example, then he went on to say, for example, we have here in our corporation, if you're going to be successful, You've got to have a spouse that, okay, and everybody, he said, well, is that, and he said, well, is that a requirement? And sometimes, you don't have to have a spouse, and she has got to have a wife. She has to fit a certain set of criteria. And there were 14 men around this table, and one woman. Everybody, this was his senior day. He asked everybody at the party, he asked, is that a requirement? Then somebody was like, hey, if you want to talk about somebody say, well, hey, if you want to talk about requirements, we got this set of requirements. If you're going to get into senior management, you've got to be known by senior management.